All right, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Super excited to have you all here for this webinar about how to manage government grant funding. So we will be diving in just a few minutes. We're going to go ahead and let people kind of trickle in as attendees. But super excited to be here with Ansley, the CEO and founder of Atlas Solutions. I'll let her introduce herself in just a moment. But some housekeeping things. As you come in, you will notice that we do have chat to say, well, that's for your security and everyone else's. But as we are going through the presentation and the discussion today, please do know that a couple things will happen. One is we will be having a bit of a fireside chat about how to manage government grant funding. So during that chat, if something piques your interest or if you have a question, please use the Q&A tool to submit a question to us. We will open up the kind of Q&A section towards the end of the webinar. As we see more or less questions kind of flow in, we will address those. And so we'll have a section at the end. Also, this webinar will be recorded and then posted on YouTube a little bit later. And we will also send out an email with this recording. So if you're unable to stay for the whole thing or you weren't able to dive in properly because you got distracted, this will be available later. So super excited to have you all here. My name is Sedale Turbovsky. I am the CEO and co-founder of OpenGrants, and we are the easy way to win grant funding. And I'm super excited to introduce Ansley Fender here. She is founder and CEO of Atlas Solutions. And Ansley, if you want to just take a little bit of time to introduce yourself and introduce Atlas, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ansley, and my company is called Atlas, and we are a post-award grant management software. So we specialize after the award's been given. And we are the first grant management software to bring funders and recipients together into the same platform so that they can manage collaboratively and really understand what their collective impact is.
Awesome. And for those of you who maybe are not aware of why that is super cool, we are going to get into that in a little bit. But first, I'm going to go ahead and roll out a poll here. Would love to just hear, take the temperature of the room today. Hear how you're doing, how you're feeling. So if you could just go ahead and respond to the poll, let us know how you're doing, what you're kind of like excited about potentially. And while we're doing that, just want to kind of like give a little bit of additional kind of framing to the discussion today. So today we're going to be chatting particularly and specifically about managing government grant funding. And this is a great conversation to have if you're a organization considering getting grants, or maybe you're an organization that has grants and you're kind of hoping to optimize that process. So please do feel free to use the Q&A tool once again to reach out with any specific questions you have about any content or any topics we discuss. And then as we move through the conversation, we will be cognizant of those, and we'll also open up the end of the discussion today for a more of like a focused Q&A session after we have our discussion. So thank you all for being here once again. And we're going to go ahead and dive right in. So I'm seeing a lot of folks who are, I'm going to go ahead and share this with everyone. Seeing a lot of folks who are energetic and excited to learn, some cautiously optimistic individuals, some folks looking for some midweek inspiration, and some folks in the other bucket. So thank you all for participating. We're excited, and hopefully this is a super useful session and something that you can really dig your teeth into. So once again, please feel free pop any questions you have in the Q&A. But we're just going to kick it off. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll out and stop sharing the screen here. And Ansley, it's super exciting what you're doing with Atlas. Also, obviously, you've spent a lot of time thinking about grant management and grants in general. What high level, why are we having this discussion? Obviously, I think people know generally that maybe government grants might be hard to manage. But when it comes to managing grants, what are the things that people should expect from that process? What's the stuff that high level, if you had to give people 3 or 4 points, what's the stuff they should expect to be doing? How is that going to impact their organization if they get a big government grant or a small one?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people are totally unprepared for what a government grant involves. And I think a lot of that is because there's been a huge shift since COVID that it's more outcomes based. So from a high level, the biggest thing is you have to prove to the funder that you were a good investment, just like you would if this was like an actual like investment. So really understanding the finances, the budgets, and the outcomes, and seeing like how all that works together and why they made the right choice. Because at the end of the day, like getting into their mindset, they have to go back to their stakeholders and tell them what they did. So it's just this loop of, I gave you money, you spent it, you produce these outcomes for you as a recipient and them as the funder. So from a high level, that's the big thing that you're dealing with.
Awesome. No, that's great context. So when you think about like kind of like the best ways to be prepared for that, or the best ways to build out that relationship, any tips and tricks that come to mind of like, or well, how do we get prepared and how do we navigate that?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I think the biggest thing is just really like before you ever apply, making sure that you have the controls in place. Like trying to be prepared after you've already won the funding is too late in a lot of cases, and there's a lot at stake if you mismanage something. So just auditing your systems and just saying, okay, is our accounting software prepared? Do we have some way of managing these outcomes? What is our workflow going to be? And obviously that's going to change as you go and get more familiar. But really just auditing the whole thing. I mean, I'm biased. I'm going to say get grant management software because it's just going to be an all-in-one tool, but really just understanding the ins and outs of the contract and what all goes into it.
Yeah, no, I that's super super valuable. And I think, one of the things that you talked about there, just like making sure you have controls in place. I mean, I find that it's super hard, of course, because every agency and sometimes even within agencies, there's different requirements. So I've seen everything from like, oh, you need time tracking for all your employees to, hey, you need, this kind of like compliant software or processes around your data collection. Are there any frameworks that you've seen like, Atlas Solutions, like there's a lot of tools, but any like sort of frameworks or first steps people should take to understand what those specific requirements are? I think typically I've seen them published in like the RFPs themselves, but sometimes they're not there. Sometimes you got to like click through several links to like some federal or state statute about like how data gets treated. Any thinking there, like how do you even start that process?
So I think for federal grants, it's really important. Like, obviously, what you're trying to fund with a grant, go to those agencies and stay up to date. Most of them have newsletters. So like, for instance, if you're getting money from the Department of Defense, CMMC compliance, staying up to date on all the regulations with that, SBIR, knowing if it's going to be reapproved or not, which luckily it was. But just really staying up to date on the programs, the whole ecosystem around what the agency does, what they're funding, how they're changing is really, really helpful. Those are not the things you want to find out after it's been awarded. So, being inside their ecosystem is also going to keep you aware of what's available. Yeah,
awesome. And I think so. Grant management, it's not like people go to school to get a degree in grant management. This is like this very strange kind of mystical thing that you have people do. Do you have any thoughts on like what kind of people, like what kind of other skills translate well to this space is kind of what I'm getting at, right? Like, is it your accountant? Like, is it a grant writer, or is it just, how do you find grant managers?
That's hard. They're very type A people. I mean, so I guess maybe the easiest way to answer this is, so my background, so I did grant management, grant analysis. My background spans financial consulting, project management, like all sorts of different things inside of the area that I was working in. So it is one part finance, one part just keeping everything together. I would say if you had to pick one, they've got to understand finance. But to be perfectly honest, CPAs are not always the best grant managers because grant management is not accounting. It's close, but it's not the same thing. So I think it's probably better to have a mix of finance background and someone who understands the initiative that you're wanting to fund with this grant. Like, what are the programs? What kind of outcomes can you expect from this? And can be able to speak intelligently about that specific, impact area.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Having managed and worked in this space for a long time as well, I think the that's definitely a fair assessment. I also think though there's so much there's project management that goes into it as well. There's the finance side is really where you get in trouble, right? Like that's the one you want to make sure you got down, because
Sure.
if you mess that up, you end up in real hot water with the government. But there's also project management and other kinds of, you're managing subcontractors sometimes and subawardees and those kinds of folks. So one of the things that I think maybe people discount sometimes, or they try to loop into the same boat, is like, it's a very specific and nuanced kind of skill, certainly. And it's probably not something that you just want to throw somebody at, because that's like pretty risky, and you can end up in some problems. So I think, Atlas does a great job of providing the software. And, at OpenGrants, we certainly have grant management, professionals who will, come in and manage grants for you. Any thoughts on, at what stage do you go from, hey, we're going to get an internal person to use some tools, or we're going to go hire like an outside firm to do this for us? Those are all options, of course. And I just wondered, do you have thoughts on what makes sense for different size orgs? Like, is there like a clear point where you should be like, oh, I should just hire a grant manager? Or is it something you feel like you should always outsource?
I don't think it's something that should be outsourced most of the time. I mean, if it's your first time getting a grant and it's a relatively small grant, or you're a really, really small team, and it doesn't make sense to hire someone because hiring is expensive, then sure, outsource. But I think it's one of those things where it's like the chicken or the egg problem. Should you have a person, or should you have software, or a combination of the two? I mean, you could buy all the software in the world, but if you don't have a person to manage it, it doesn't matter. So it's a combination of both. And I think it's why a lot of software platforms also offer like a consulting side. So if you can't afford a person, or you just don't want to hire a person, you can get the software plus service. But I think there's a critical mass of either number of grants or total grant funding where it's like, okay, this is now like a revenue line item. Like, this is something we do all the time. We should have someone to manage this. And usually it starts as, it's just another thing that they do as part of their job. And then it expands into, we need a dedicated person for this. And then you end up getting a grants team. But I think making sure that you're balancing software and humans is important, because managing a grant totally manually is just not a great idea typically.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. So we've talked a little bit about the people, and somewhat about like how to prepare in terms of like being aware of what kinds of controls you have in place. And I want to elaborate a bit on that, because, overall, I'm hoping folks will take away from this some general like understanding and tips and tricks about grant management. And so, in the space of kind of like auditing controls, there's kind of financial controls that you need to be aware of. There's sort of HR, like human resources controls that you need to be aware of. There's data integrity and kind of reporting controls that you need to be aware of. And then there's also just, project management. So like kind of integrity in terms of like hitting your deadlines and those kinds of things. So when we talk about, that there's that pre-work, and then there's the work of like getting it done, and you're probably bringing in a person to tackle that. But post award, there's also just kind of like final reports, and there's a lot of value in kind of maintaining those relationships with your funders, because you might get, you can potentially go and apply for more grant funding. And if you've done a good job, they're usually pretty excited to continue to fund you. So what, any thoughts on how like grant management relates to that? Do you have any suggestions for folks about how to continue to build those relationships and double down on, a successful engagement with a funder who's given you capital already?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts. And I touched on this briefly a little bit ago, but getting inside the mind of your funder, they have, especially at the government level, they have a ton of money that they're giving out, and they're giving it out pretty much every year, unless it's like COVID relief funding or something. And they have to go back to their boss and Congress and the taxpayers and say, yeah, we didn't screw up here. So they need to know that you're a safe bet and that they are actually helping you. So being able to articulate what it is that you're going to do and how you're going to measure it, and then being able to prove that you did that but also being able to convince them that they are the unique partner to get this done with you. Like you applied to them for a reason, not just because they're, they have money. And I mean, everyone likes to feel like they're doing good by helping you out. So I think just playing both sides of those things and being really, really clear on what it is that you do and that you've proven that you've done it, and that, based on that, you can do it again if they're willing to give you money again.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. And so it's, for folks listening, one thing I want to highlight or articulate is that this, we're talking in very general terms because the space is so huge, and it means different things to manage a research grant to a grant for city government to but the government grant funding space is huge, and it covers so many different things. So these are kind of a first principles approach and a first principles discussion to how do you optimize this relationship? How do you make sure you don't get in trouble? How do you make sure that you can go back and ask for more funds and feel confident in that relationship? And these are all really good tips, and then they can be applied specifically to specific agencies based on the nuances. And what Ansley said, I think, is huge. It's like get in the mind of your partner. And they are your partner, so also think of them that way, right? So don't have some weird kind of antagonistic or other kind of relationship with them. Like, think of them like a partner, because that's, effectively, if you do your job the right way, that's what they become, and they can become a really long-term partner in many cases, with years and years of funding potentially, depending on what you're trying to do. So I think that for those listening, these are definitely like first principles, and we're happy to answer questions that go more specifically towards maybe a use case. So feel free to ask those specific questions in the Q&A, and we'll definitely get into them. One thing that I want to touch on, because it is at the core of this, is at the end of the day, you can have delays on projects, and you can have slip-ups and deliverables. But one thing you better not do is mess up the money. The government and just everyone in general actually can get very touchy about that, and it can lead to some very real legal problems for your org. So any thoughts, suggestions you have for folks who are exploring useful frameworks for implementing policy and financial controls for government grants?
Yes. Definitely check in the RFP and obviously in the contract, but what sort of financial compliance you need to adhere to. Usually it's GAAP compliance, and that has some massive implications for the organization. If it's an award to a nonprofit, they're usually a little less concerned about that. SBIR, yeah, GAAP compliance all the way. And that's the case for most, federal contractors or any for-profits getting money. One thing that I always try to make people aware of, though, is that accounting and grant management are not necessarily the same thing. So while your books need to be GAAP compliant and need to be consistent, and you need to file your taxes and do all that stuff on time, grant management can run next to that and sort of alongside that. If you're applying for reimbursements, you might be able to change a date on something to reflect when the value was actually received by your organization. So just being really clear on what you're allowed to do inside that framework, but making sure that at the end of the day, your accounting software is clean. Like, your books are up to standard and squeaky clean. Passing an audit is no small thing, and if you don't pass it, that's huge.
Yeah, awesome. And just for those who maybe don't know, the term you used is GAAP compliance, and that's an acronym which means something. Generally generally accepted accounting principles. Clearly,
there
you go. I honestly, I'm like, I think that's what it means, but I don't know. So I'll let you tell everybody. I
can't believe I remembered that.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Yeah, we do like acronyms in this space. So no, that's great feedback. And I think echoing that, it's definitely, you want to have that stuff really dialed in, because it really does, at the end of the day, a lot of this does come down to money and reporting and making sure that there is a real, like, there for the agency to come back to you and say, hey, they did great. they didn't do anything terrible. I was on a call with an agency once, and they're like 70% of our audit findings came back with like negative results, like people messed up something. And so it's not uncommon for folks to struggle with this. And that can be a real stumbling block for folks, because if you do it wrong, sometimes you're not going to get another chance, in fact, and it can be a real problem for your org. So definitely dial that stuff in. Everyone ultimately, and that's the segue to this next part, like everyone eventually, if you get a lot of government grants in particular, you're going to get audited. And I know that like audit is not a word that people enjoy, but it also doesn't have to be a scary, terrible word. It can be just like, oh, we have an audit and we did all our recording and accounting properly, and we're just going to submit all this stuff and it's all going to go very smoothly. Like that's the ideal situation. So when you talk about audits, in particular with the federal government, but also state governments will audit, come in and do audits. What are the things that companies should do to prepare for those? Is there, are there tools that help you prepare? What should we be doing for that?
The biggest one is making sure your books are in order. Like these audits start with the finances. Then if they find problems, they'll start digging into everything else. And like, this is a sidebar, but I was on a call with someone who's a like fraud investigator for the SBIR program. And she's like, the amount of accidental fraud committed would boggle your mind. I mean, you see occasional headlines where it's like, some researcher from some university committed millions of dollars worth of fraud. Like that's super rare. By and large, it's everyday people that just didn't realize they were supposed to do something. Mm-hmm. And the government doesn't care if you didn't realize it. I mean, that sounds fortunate, but that's how it is. So the biggest thing is making sure that your books are in order, your taxes are being filed. If you don't have a CPA that you use like month to month, that's fine. But your CPA should definitely take a look at your books before you file your taxes. So that's the biggest one. The next one is if they find any problems, they're going to start digging, and they're going to dig deep. So making sure that you have documentation for everything, that you have receipts, ideally that those transactions are tagged with those receipts already, so that you're not having to like open up every software platform you use and turn it over to the government. And, like that just, it gets tedious and it gets time consuming. And if they think that you're not organized, they will dig deeper. So the biggest thing is, if they ask for something, you can give them all the documentation that goes with that. And to the point of being ridiculous, because they will see like you absolutely know what you're talking about. You can back up this information, and usually they'll leave you alone. They don't want to be there any more than you want them to be there, to be perfectly honest. So if you can make their lives easy, they'll be quick and they'll get out of there.
Yeah, no. So I think, this is one of those tensions that I am always, hoping to explain and like really evangelize about, which is the fact that the minute you get a government grant, you are not only, the money is great, but it comes with some strings and some requirements. And I think for early stage companies in particular, but also organizations, it's a great opportunity to really build a super robust and, well-developed ecosystem for your company. And it's nice when you're early, and there's like 4 employees, it's easy to lay this framework in place to make sure you can pass an audit. And it sets you up for so much success. And if you are in the business of going after government money, you're going to need this stuff anyways. So take the time, please, like find either a consultant or do it yourself, but like get this stuff in place. I think I have been through a variety of audits on behalf of customers. And, it's really nice to be able to just say, hey, here's the files. It's all here. It's all tagged, it's all ready to go, and they can just take it and roll through it. And it's a great practice to put in place for your company. It just makes you that much more, ready to scale and grow as an organization. I feel like it's harder for if you get to the enterprise side of things and you're big and you've got 200 employees at that point, it's a bit harder to put all this stuff in place. But early on, it's really worth it. And so I see grants as this opportunity, as in particular, if you're getting a government grant, it's a great opportunity to just put this stuff in place and get off on the right foot professionally. And it'll, you can maintain a very high standard of operational kind of organization. Any thoughts on?
There's one other thing inside that too, that I run into a lot with customers is, make sure that you're setting up your accounting software for grants. And that's something that people are like, I don't like, what does that even mean? And so it can look a lot of different ways, but to make sure that your accounting software and your grant accounting can like run on parallel tracks, you do not want to overhaul your accounting system for one grant that may never happen again. Because you need those month to month and, you know, like just period over period comparisons. And if you have line items that are constantly coming and going and fluctuating because you put your grant and all your budget line items in your chart of accounts, like the income and expense categories, that's not a great way to do that. Lots of people have opinions about this, and like if people have specific questions, like I'm happy to talk more about this, but making sure that you talk to a CPA or some, like probably more specifically a grant consultant, about how to set up all of that, because it will absolutely affect your ability to, if you're for profit, raise money, if you're, you know, venture backable or get a loan or any of those other things. So making sure that you're looking at this in the grand scheme of your finances as well. Because if you don't, you can mess yourself up in other places down the road because you went all in on managing your grants and neglected the rest of the financial, you know, ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to add some additional complexity or you know, potentially, there's a lot of different there's a lot of other capital products and other grants that you might need. So there's, you know, for example, one of the really cool ones that just got announced is if you happen to be in the climate space, Enduring Planet, which is a really cool company that we're big fans of. If you get a grant to work on something in the climate arena, they will actually deploy that capital for you ahead of when you might receive that grant, because it does take some time. So sometimes it's like 6 months. So definitely, you know, if you've got something like that going on where you're like, look, we have all of these activities going on. We've got venture dollars coming in. We have debt instruments. We have all these, you know, we have this complex ecosystem, and frequently that's the case, right? So for an early stage company in particular, you're probably, you know, pulling capital from a variety of spaces. And maybe grants is something that happens as a one-off, or maybe it's something that you're going to do serially. But either way, you need to be, you know, managing your business on top of, like, you don't want to just be the grant business, right? Like, hopefully you're out there trying to create a product, or you know, maybe you are the grant business, maybe you're a research lab or something. But you know, there's a whole universe of capital out there. It can be used very tactically, and so you want to be setting yourself up for success, which is huge. I see a good stack of questions in here, Ansley, so maybe we'll dive into that a little bit. But
Sure.
I also want to, the question I was going to ask is, are there and you haven't talked about Atlas Solutions very much, which I think is super, you know, that's cool, but also is a very cool product. And I just want to like touch briefly on what kind of tools do exist to help you get set up. You know, a lot of people use QuickBooks. We've seen people use Excel sheets, which I don't recommend because that's terrible. And you know, it's 2022, so we can probably do away with the Excel sheets for budgets, please, and do something that's easier. Any thoughts? You know, I know there's an evolution of tooling and providers in this space. Any thoughts on maybe two things? One, any good like firms that you'd recommend that might do this kind of very specific grant accounting work? And then any tools that you might recommend for grant accounting and like managing that?
Sure. So it's so easy to hate on like the spreadsheet grant managers, but to be perfectly honest, until pretty recently, it was, here's your basically free spreadsheet or $100,000 piece of software. Like, that is not a choice. You're going to go with the free option, obviously, and you're going to just do a bunch of extra manual work. So I think there are a couple of things that you want to make sure with accounting software. And I mean, I'll just speak from Atlas as like sort of the baseline framework, because obviously that's what I know. It's my company. So the big thing is like having a way to, like I've said, like run your accounting and your grant management parallel to each other. Get that information out of your accounting software, do your grant management inside of grant management software. CPAs are happy, the IRS is happy, your grant people are happy. When everyone's happy, you can be happy too. The other side of that is being able to see your real-time data. That is why spreadsheets don't work. It is not real-time. You're always being reactive instead of proactive. So get that account information, like the accounting information, transaction level information inside your accounting software, see that real-time budget versus actual. You can split transactions between different budget line items. If you're over in one place and under on another, and it's something that can be moved, you can do that really easily. These are all things that are not easy in a spreadsheet. Then being able to track your outcome metrics and track those back to a specific funding source or a specific program that is being funded by a grant. That's really helpful too, because you might be more efficient or more effective with one grant or in one program, and being able to compare internally between different programs and grants, but also with other similar organizations. What are you doing? What does your program design look like? Are you more efficient? Why? What are you measuring? Like all of these things, this sort of like knowledge hub hasn't really existed previously because people are not managing data in real time, and they're certainly not sharing it with each other because it's all in spreadsheets. So I think that is one big shift that will happen over the next few years. And then lastly, just being able to have all of your tasks and documents in one place. It sounds so simple, but like we've said with auditing, you need to have all of that in one place. It's really, really easily accessible. And then something to just remind you and your whole team without you having to walk down the hall to, Craig in Office 5 and say, hey, I need you to do this, or, with remote work, constant emails or Slack messages. And then lastly, reporting. If it's on a spreadsheet or you're just using your accounting software, it ends up in a spreadsheet anyway. And then, I think that the average is like 8 hours to prepare a grant report. It can be up to 12 full working days inside a year-long grant cycle. That's insane. So yeah, so you want to be able to tell your financial story and your outcome story in the same place. And that data has to be able to communicate with each other. Otherwise, you're getting a tiny sliver of the picture. So like the way I like to describe it is with grant management software, you're looking at something in 360 degrees. With a spreadsheet, it's like one dimensional, maybe two, if you're really, really good at spreadsheets. But you're just missing, you're not building your capacity as an organization. You're surviving basically.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I think that is one of the big benefits, I think, of just modern technology in general. And really super exciting to hear you talk about that, because it is one of those things that, as we think about like the real reason that we want to deploy grant money and create impacts in the world, it's like, yeah, obviously this is about money, but it's also about creating transformational change and offering services to people and understanding how effective the capital is and making those things happen. And it's a level of intelligence and like data-driven sort of empirical decision-making that hasn't been very it hasn't existed, unfortunately, in this space. And that really impacts the efficacy and utility of this capital in a very significant way. So very excited to see that brought to fruition. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the Q&A panel here. Some great questions. So we'll start right here at the top. How often should we communicate with our funder? I'll throw that one your way.
I think that's unique. I think it's a case-by-case basis type of thing. Typically people will say, especially in the SBIR, STTR world, when you send in your proposal, reach out to the program manager. If you really think about it, any agency is giving out hundreds of grants. Like if every person is trying to interface with them all the time, they would never get anything done. So I definitely reach out if you have a question or a concern or whatever. But I think most of this information is in the RFP or the contract. So if you can handle it yourself, try to, but definitely reach out if you have questions. Do not assume anything.
Yeah, I'll just tag on to that. I'll highlight the RFP. Probably per the terms of your contract, there's like a specific amount of time you should be reaching out. And then you may want to reach out more depending on how you're looking at that relationship and building it. So great questions here. How much does the software cost? And I assume they're talking about Atlas. If you want to go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, so because we're funder side and recipient side, there's two different pricing models. If you're a funder, it's 2% of funds dispersed and all of your recipients get to use it for free. There's an upper limit. Like if you have $1 billion in grants, you're not paying 2% of $1 billion. But on the recipient side, it's tiered based on the total dollar amount of grants that you're managing. So under $50,000 a year, you're paying $50 a month. The top tier is $750 to $1 million. You're paying $1,000 a month. Over $1 million, and federal grants especially, you are being audited. And so we custom quote that because there's some other considerations in there of, we're very high touch. So we will be interfacing with you a lot more if you have several $1 million in grants. But yeah, that's the basic structure.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Really great question here. And there's a few similar to it. What are the ramifications of shortfalls in project milestones? How does a grant manager best present such shortfalls to the government? Ansley, your take on this would be great, and I'm happy to chime in, but I, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you're guessing. You don't know what you're going to be capable of. In a lot of cases, you haven't had a windfall of funding for a specific project or program, so you're guessing. And a lot of times, I know, especially in the nonprofit space, but even in the government space, if you just reach out and say, hey, this thing happened, we need to adjust this, they're usually pretty flexible, but you need to reach out and get buy-in from them. Usually it's like a formal request to change a budget or to change an outcome or something like that. But at the end of the day, they just want you to succeed. They can't just like take the money back unless you've done something illegal or fraudulent. So they just want to make sure that you're able to spend the money. If you don't spend it all, they're probably going to have you repay it. But yeah, just be super proactive about reaching out and saying, this is what happened. This is why we can't do this. This is what we're going to do instead. This is our request.
Yeah, great advice. And I will say that this extends, like, I know that maybe some of the questions here about research, but this extends to all projects, right? Like the government as a partner is very aware of the fact that like the world exists. Like it's like, oh, I'm going to build a building. Well, there was a problem with the foundation and something cracked and I need $1 million more. Like they're aware that like these things happen, but you do definitely like, don't hide it from them. And definitely as soon as you're aware there's a problem, let them know and say, look, this is happening. What can we do? Because that's really like, they're your partner in this. They do want to see you succeed, definitely. So everything Ansley said, 100%. And then like really, I've been in this position. The best way to present it is just, ideally come to them with the problem and the solution as suggestions on how to fix it. But, make them aware of the problem as soon as possible. And if it's going to take you some time to figure out the solution, then maybe make them aware of the problem first. The other thing that I will say is the government moves super slow, right? So it is like, that's kind of a saving grace for you as someone who's on the other end of the arrangement. Is like in private industry in particular, it's like, hey, we need things done now. The government, you might come to them and look, we're like 6 months behind. And they'll be like, oh, that's fine. Like they have projects that are 10 years behind. So 6 months is just fine. So definitely, right. Don't aspire, obviously, to miss and have shortfalls, but at the same time, it's not an insurmountable problem, and don't be afraid to bring that up. As long as, like what Ansley said, as long as you haven't done anything fraudulent or illegal, you're good. You're trying to do the best. They're trying to do the best. It's it's all good. Some questions here about what's the typical size of a grant you consider using software for or a person for? Like, are there money like at 100 grand, at 10 grand? Does it make sense anytime? What are your thoughts there on like the right size of project?
That's a really tough question. And it's a combination of quantity of grants and total dollar amount of grants. There's a reason why our lowest tier is up to $50,000. Because it's one, like I've seen grants that are $20,000 that require monthly reporting and just like ridiculous stuff. You don't want to do that in a spreadsheet, but you also don't want to buy software that costs the total amount of the grant because you can't. So I think it's a combination of how big is your team? How adept are they at finance and at grant management? And are you wanting to become a grant funded organization long term? If you're small, if you don't have the requisite experience inside your team and you want to keep getting grants, the time to get grant software is yesterday. And like we also have a free tier too, so shameless plug. But yeah, so I think it's a combination of where you want to go. Like if you looked at your organization at 5x the size it is, or 5 years down the road, what does that look like? If there's a ton of grants there, probably start thinking about your internal controls and how software can fit into that. It might be that in the short term, it's a hack together, like duct taped tech stack with Zapier making everything communicate. That's okay in the short term, but just make sure you're being agile with the tools that you're using.
Yeah, great advice. There's a few questions that kind of focus around this. I know we brought up and we talked a bit about like accounting software versus grant management software. And I wonder if you could go a bit deeper on that and like
Sure.
really address like, how does accounting software not work for grant management, and why do you need something else? Like what's wrong with just QuickBooks, for example?
Yeah, so there's actually an article on our website about how to manage your grants in QuickBooks and at what point you don't want to do that. So if you want to go like down the rabbit hole, I would point you there. And I think the link is actually in the chat to just the general website. But to try to be as quick as possible at this, there's two ways to manage grants in accounting software. And I'll specifically use QuickBooks because it's the most popular by a long shot. So you can embed it into your chart of accounts, which is the income, expense, asset, liability, equity accounts that are like the backbone of your accounting system. Or you can use something like classes or tags or anything that's basically going to turn your reports into like a matrix. The problem with putting it into your chart of accounts is that you should not add or delete things unless it's like a permanent fixture inside your organization, because it limits your ability to do period over period comparisons. So if you constantly have things adding and falling off, it's really complicated. The other side of that is if you've created expense line items for all of your grant budget line items, well, that's a payroll expense, not just like grant budget line item A expense. So you're ending up in spreadsheets. Like the goal is to get out of spreadsheets. So of the two methods I mentioned, do not put it in your chart of accounts. Like, please, it drives me crazy personally, but it's just bad for the organization in general. The other option is something like classes, where again, it's going to turn it into a matrix. So if you run like a profit and loss by class or tag or whatever, you're going to see your accounts down one side and then the classes across the top. It will end up in a spreadsheet again, because of the way that accounting software actually generates those reports. But it is easier. You can definitely, it's a great short-term solution. If you're already using QuickBooks, there's really no additional cost, which is great. So that's how I would do that. In a perfect world, though, you're pulling that stuff out of your accounting software. So your accounting software is literally just for like the CPAs, the bean counters, the people who need to keep that stuff in order. They don't care about the details of your grants and about your grant reporting. So if you can pull that information out, now you can split things based on budget line items. You can split things based on different grants or different programs. You can get into the weeds because you're focusing on a very small area of your finances. This is also where you can potentially, depending on what's in your grant contract, change dates if you're requesting reimbursements. If something clears the first of the month, but you actually spent it the last month based on GAAP compliance, you may not be able to do that in your accounting software, but you may be able to do that for your grants. So just sort of like what is the long-term goal here? It's very different than the goal of your accounting software. So that was a very quick and dirty version. But that's generally the landscape of how those things fit together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great. Here's a cool one. I don't know if I have a really kind of deep answer here, but perhaps you do, Ansley. I know you've seen probably more of this. What considerations have you seen for 501c3 fiscal sponsors that manage government grants at one time, that might be managing multiple projects?
Yeah, I see this a lot, actually. So what was the question? What considerations?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty broad question. So I'm going to make some assumptions here. So if you're talking about a fiscal sponsor that is then like sub-granting, like has sub-recipients and now has that sort of pass-through relationship, absolutely use the software for that. Because you now have to take their information and roll it up into a report that you have to submit. Like at the end of the day, you're the one on the line, not them, typically. So I think just getting really clear, like making sure that everything you have to comply with is now pushed off on them, like that they are able to adhere to those things, that they have the financial controls and the fiscal management and all that kind of stuff to be able to report to you so that you are not outside compliance. That's the biggest one. And that relationship can get hairy quickly.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Couple other really good ones here. One is a great question, and maybe I'll throw it your way first. How do private entities differ from government agencies? And I'm going to say in terms of sort of like grant management requirements. So thinking about like foundations and other groups, and I'm happy to tackle this one more. Definitely something that we deal with a lot in our space, if you want. But
yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
So I think, you know, the big difference here, and this will be really quick, in fact, big difference is just like who you're reporting to and what their requirements are, right? So in any grant situation, and I know we're mostly talking about government grants, but in any grant situation, you're typically signing a contract that has a bunch of requirements. And honestly, the government can be a bit more heavy-handed in the requirements because they have the legal team and the money to back it up. You know, frequently private entities are a little more lightweight in terms of like the requirements they're putting on you. At the same time, there's some that are very bureaucratic and large, and for no other reason than they have all these systems in place, they have to put a lot of constraints. So, you know, there's a big difference between maybe your local community foundation, who might have like $1 million, and the Ford Foundation, who literally just like influences how medical research happens. So like there's big differences between the size of the private entities. And there's just, you know, if you don't think there's any standardization in government, there's even less standardization out there. So just get ready to like read through those requirements, make sure the contract you're signing makes sense, and that you're ready to comply with all of the controls and other things they're going to impose.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Exactly. The biggest difference is going to be in the reporting cadence. It's usually not reimbursement. It's usually not monthly. It's usually longer term. So yeah, definitely read the RFP.
Yeah. A great question here that I'll send your way, Ansley. This individual was hired by their team to project manage the first year of a 5-year Department of Education demonstration grant. And they think they're like, I'm starting to worry about the financial accounting aspect. How do they make sure the project is set up appropriately from a financial perspective? I think obviously the specific answer is a lot more nuanced, but maybe some high level stuff about like red flags, what things you should do to make things run smoothly.
Yeah, that's tough. That relationship gets really hard when finance and project management are like really segregated. So I would say you need to spend a whole bunch of time with whoever's managing the book. Because the biggest, like, you're not a finance person, but now you are if you're managing a grant, unfortunately. So when it comes time for report, I mean, if it's a 5-year grant, there's going to be more than one report due within that period of time. It's at least going to be annual, probably more often than that. So getting really clear on how your books are set up, on how your financial person thinks, how they tag transactions with accounts and things like that. They need to understand your job as well as you do, and you need to understand their job as well as they do. Maybe not all the way, but pretty darn close. Because if any of those two things fail, your reporting just got really janky. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Good luck to you. But
Good
also
luck.
feel free to reach out. There's lots of
yeah, for sure. That
here.
too.
Email us. Yeah. Awesome.
That sounds terrible.
Let's see. Lots of good questions here. I really appreciate it, everyone. We will get through these as best as possible, and then also send follow-ups. A great question here. Working on an ARPA-E concept paper. How should how I manage the project be included in the paper?
Interesting. You want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say a couple things. One is without like reading the solicitation or the invitation, I'm not really sure if it should be or not. But what I will say that people sometimes forget to do is that for many government grants, the work of grant management is frequently eligible for funding. And so as you put in your proposals, be sure to budget and allocate money for grant management and grant management software if that's something that you think you're going to buy, because the government will fully pay for that and will indeed reimburse you, and that's an eligible expense. So you know, the specific answer to your question about the ARPA-E paper, don't know without reading it. Unfortunately, there's almost no standardization out there, as we've mentioned several times, so hard to say. But we'll say that as hopefully you get invited to submit a full proposal, and when you do, be sure to include money for somebody to manage that grant for you. Even if it's just for you, be sure to include that in your budget, because it's generally speaking an eligible expense. So be sure to do that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is sometimes there are not things like something won't be included in an RFP that is like open knowledge among that agency. So for instance, SBIR, they like NSF specifically, they want you to show that you're likely to fail. That's a weird thing. Like unless you're a researcher where you fail all the time, you don't typically think in those terms. So doing some research, talking to the program director and stuff about that kind of thing, because if you miss out on funding just because you didn't realize they were looking at this through a slightly different framework than you are, would stink. So I think this is a good reason to reach out to a program manager and say, hey, like what kind of things should I put in here? They are going to be part of the review process. So the more they know about you and what you're doing, the more they can advocate on your behalf.
Yeah, definitely build up that relationship. 100%. Great question here. What KPIs are typically tracked with grant accounting software? And is grant accounting software typically tied via API to general ledger accounting software?
Interesting. I can't speak for any others. I will speak specifically for what I know. So grant management software is not going to include any KPIs. You are going to decide what those are. So I know in the case of Atlas, you are giving it a name, an amount, and units. So 100 meetings, 10 case management, whatever that looks like, whatever you need, and you're giving it a start and end date. In terms of interfacing with accounting software, it's one-way sync. You do not want stuff that you've changed from your accounting software in your grant management software going back. Accounting software is king for sure. So information comes in, it does not go back out. And that's on purpose. That would potentially be bad. So yeah, I mean, there is like, if you're not using QuickBooks, you can upload or manually add. It really comes down to your transaction volume specifically for your grants versus your general transaction volume. If you do 1,000 transactions a month and have 10 grant transactions, you do not want 1,000 transactions coming in from your accounting software. That's just noise. So yeah, short answer to your question. This is all figured out in the course of onboarding and all that kind of stuff because it's unique to every organization.
Yeah, and unfortunately, not to like sound the refrain again, but because the reporting requirements are diverse across, even within agencies, depending on the program you're participating in, it makes much more sense to have something in place, whether it's Atlas or another solution, or even in a spreadsheet. Like you're going to define the KPIs. In fact, when you submit your grant proposal, you're going to say, oh, yeah, we're going to build 3 buildings and we're going to educate 200 people, or something along those lines, or we're going to discover a new intervention for cancer. Whatever it is that you're working on, you're defining, generally speaking, and it's actually one of the cool things about grants is, generally speaking, you are defining the metrics by which you are going to be judged with your funder. And so that's something that you want to be aware of. And then generally you, in terms of framework, you want to then set up at a very early stage the ability to track progress towards those metrics and track those metrics. And to the extent you can automate it, I mean, that's amazing. Great questions around the board. KPI, key program indicators. It's your metrics.
Key performance. Yeah.
Key performance indicators.
One other thing to be clear about with KPIs, or whatever acronym you want to give them, outputs and outcomes are not the same thing. Be really clear about what the difference is. An output, like let's talk. I mean, obviously, homeless shelter. Like let's just use a homeless shelter. It's really easy. An output is meals served. An outcome is people permanently housed. You're not paying them to serve meals. You're paying them to permanently house people. There's a difference there. I don't like, the government doesn't really care about your outputs. They want to know about your outcomes. So just be really, really clear on what those two things are. And they do work together. They're both important, but they want to know what your outcomes are.
Yeah, beautiful. Awesome. We have about 5 minutes left, and I think this last question I think is great, and I want to go a little deep on it, and then we will kick to sort of like last kind of closing notes here. But it's a great question. What do we mean by framework? If we have an accounting software we use and protocols for receipts, what else comes into a framework? Any thoughts you want to share? And I'm happy to share some thoughts as well.
Yeah, so if you think about the grand scheme of a grant, you're dealing with finances, outcomes, programs or projects, task documents, and reporting. If your framework does not include those 5 or 6 things, it's insufficient. You might actually have those other things, but not be thinking of them as part of your framework. But the biggest thing is you have got to hit on all of those things, or you have a deficiency somewhere, and your chances of mismanaging your grant or forgetting something skyrocketed. This is especially important if you have a grant that's paid as reimbursements. If you miss a deadline, they're just not going to pay you for it, like, period, most of the time. So yeah, that would be what I would consider as a complete framework.
Yeah, and I would add, I think we have been vague about this term just because it is a space where there's not a lot of standardization. But I would say, generally speaking, your framework for accounting is an important piece of kind of a larger grants management framework that includes, typically whatever compliance guardrails you need to set in place. So just as an example, there's frequently grants that require that you have time tracking in place for all your employees. And it may even require, like, it's not just employees who are on the grant, it's all your employees, so that if you're audited, the agency can understand indirect and direct costs and all those things. So making sure that you have developed, based on the requirements, compliance requirements of the grant, the framework or guardrails to keep you from, at the end of the day, failing an audit, really is the point of the framework itself. It's to make sure, one, the capital keeps flowing in. As Ansley mentioned, if you're off and it's a reimbursement kind of grant, they're just not going to pay you until you get that right. And so that's a real bummer. And then the other side of the other part of the framework is more about just protecting, preparing for an audit and putting yourself in a place to be successful through an audit process. So those are two, I think, important, like, first principle approaches to the framework. Is one, be audit ready at all times, and two, be capable of continuing to flow cash out of the grant into your program. I want to thank you all for being here. This was super fun. Ansley, in particular, thank you so much for spending some time with us and having this discussion. Love what you all are doing at Atlas. There's some links in the chat. We will be sending out emails with contact and other info on how to get in touch. Thank you, everyone, for being part of the discussion and for submitting questions. Really appreciated all your thoughts. There's a few minutes left, so maybe we'll hit a couple of these in like a kind of rapid fire. Any advice on additional grant training for a new grant administrator, or any courses or thoughts, Ansley?
No, there's not a lot, unfortunately. I mean, use the contract as your guide. Like, that's the best thing I can say. I mean, I know you guys put out articles, we put out articles, we also put out video. It's like soup to nuts, like really trying to be like obnoxiously like simple up to like more complex. So that's, unfortunately, yeah, this industry is kind of on their own.
Yeah, sorry. It's hard. I learned from really good mentors. That was this trial by fire. Yeah. Is there a state focus or federal focus for most grants and RFP responders? Yeah, I mean, that just depends. Let's see, what else do we got here? Let's see. Can a grant writer?
A lot of people are asking about CRMs. If CRMs can.
You want to tackle that real fast, and then we'll close?
Yeah, the short answer is no. The reason being that they will do some things, but again, it goes back to this framework. Do you want a all-in-one solution, or do you want a duct-taped tech stack? That is a personal decision, but a CRM is going to lead you to hack together, or something like Salesforce is going to lead you to a $40,000 a year consultant to build something custom for you. It really all comes down to decisions. Yeah, but specifically donor management software, is that going to do your grant management? No, I see that a lot. It doesn't work.
I am in full agreement, having tested many of these. Well, Ansley, once again, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who attended. The questions were great. If we didn't get to yours, we'll send out info. Also, just reach out to us. Feel free to visit opengrants.io, visit Atlas Solutions, check it out. We have a cool perk at OpenGrants. If you want to get Atlas Solutions, you can sign up and get a cool discount. So all kinds of cool stuff out there to help you on your journey. Hopefully this was helpful. Ansley, any last closing remarks, anything you want to encourage folks to do as we close up?
read your RFP, read your contract, just audit all your systems top to bottom. You'd rather find out now that you have a deficiency than when a report is due or an audit happens.
100%. Don't fail your audits and make your life easier by streamlining your reporting. That's my takeaway from the day. Thank you all. We will see you next month. And feel free to reach out if you have any other questions.